Hello, thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm Spencer Overton. I'm a professor here at GW Law School, and I'm the founder and the faculty director of the GW Multiracial Democracy Project. We focus on solutions that facilitate our nation's transition to a well-functioning democracy that truly represents our increasingly diverse population. I'm excited that we recently onboarded a great executive director, Lisa Bornstein. She's got deep expertise in civil rights law and policy at the Lawyers Committee, as well as the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights. She's also got extensive nonprofit management. So excited that she's joined us. Right now, we're focused on a 3-year alternative election systems project where we're working with 15 voting rights groups here. And we're working with them on this 3-year project. Groups like LDF, MALDEF, ALDEF, the Native American Rights Fund. We're working with them to examine the implications of election reforms like proportional representation, RCV, fusion, and Final Four primary reforms, just to examine the implications in terms of people of color here. You know, our goal is that if this Supreme Court scales back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to eliminate a lot of Black and Latino districts, kind of what's the next race-neutral direction that will allow for a representation of folks in our increasingly multiracial democracy here. We also, our goal is to diversify democracy reform. That field is not incredibly diverse, and the hope is at the end, some of these organizations will help them raise some funds to hire a full-time FTE to actually participate in the democracy reform space. It's about a $9 million project, and so far we've raised about $6 million of that $9 million. We're also doing some significant work on the implications of AI for multiracial democracy. So today, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our inaugural webinar in our Democracy in Color series. The idea of this basically came from Lisa, myself. After the election, we'd seen a lot of kind of pop coverage, but we decided to, we thought it was insufficient. And we decided to create an off-the-record space for thought leaders from philanthropy, the academy, and the media to come together and consider the impact of racial and ethnic identity on the 2024 presidential election results as important context and information and discussion of how we build a multiracial democracy. We're delighted to have Professor Ashley Jardina here with us to kick off our series here. With the discussion of white voter attitudes. Professor Jardina is an assistant professor of public policy at the Franklin Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. She's the author of White Identity Politics here. It's published by Cambridge University Press. It's a great book. It certainly shaped my scholarship. She's won numerous awards, including the American Political Science Association's Robert E. Lane Award for the best book in political psychology. Her research focuses on racial attitudes, racial conflict, and the way in which group identities influence political preferences in the United States. It's been widely cited and featured in a variety of media outlets. So let me just kind of talk a little bit about our format today. She'll present for about 20 minutes. We'll record that part. Then we'll turn off the recording and open up the chat so that we can have just an off-the-record conversation here. So during the presentation, attendees will be muted. The chat feature will be visible to the hosts and the panelists only here. And if you have any technical issues, just use the chat feature to let us know. We'll moderate the discussion portion, so you'll be able to raise your hand or use the chat feature. here and just kind of get into the queue. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. I think Lisa just was able to put some of that in the chat function. So before I turn the floor over to Professor Jardina, I just want to put in a plug for our next webinar, which will be held on January 17th at 12 noon Eastern. We're thrilled that Professor Bernard Fraga, who's a professor of political science and the faculty coordinator for the Latinx Studies Initiative at Emory University. He'll join us to talk about Latino male voters in the 2024 election. We'll send out that invitation after this conversation, but please hold January 17th at 12 Eastern for that presentation. And in February, we'll be joined by Princeton political scientist, Professor Ishmael White, who will give us insights on Black male voting patterns. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Ashley Jardina. Ashley, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Spencer. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my work and to be in conversation with all of you. I just shared my screen. Is everybody able to see the screen share? All right, that's great. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about some of my ongoing research on race and democracy. And I should mention that this work is in collaboration with Professors Vincent Hutchings and Robert Mickey at the University of Michigan. And I'm going to be talking in particular about what we know about everyday Americans' commitments to democracy, and also who resists not just democracy in general, but multiracial democracy and why. So to set the stage, I want to go back to January 2021. As we're all aware, this is an image of the January 6th Capitol riot in which thousands of Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol building. They were challenging the results of the 2020 presidential election. The crowd was overwhelmingly white. Many of the insurrectionists donned Nazi symbols and Confederate flags. They left little ambiguity about their racial commitments. And in the wake of the insurrection, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi claimed that the mob and its supporters had chosen whiteness over democracy. And I think her comment raises some important and defining questions. So, are some white Americans opposed to a democracy that includes other racial and ethnic groups? And are they willing to abandon democratic principles in order to preserve the power of their racial group? And I think these are questions that we have to take very seriously, because one of the biggest challenges of our time is not only the erosion of democratic norms in the US, but the erosion of those norms, arguably as part of resistance to a multiracial democracy in which people of color have access to the same rights and privileges as white Americans. Now, the January 6th riot escalated the growing sense of alarm among many political scientists and other political observers about the erosion of democratic norms in the US. So, people are worried about the weakening of checks and balances. They're worried about the blatant efforts on the part of President Trump to use the presidency for his own personal gain, efforts to undermine the freeness and fairness of elections through money and misinformation, and efforts to make it more difficult for some groups to vote. And people argue this signals an era of democratic backsliding. So, in the context of concerns about the erosion of democratic norms in the US, the research that I'm doing now is in the service of this question: what accounts for everyday American citizens' willingness to endorse or reject certain democratic principles and policies? And understanding which Americans condone democratic backsliding and why is essential to understanding threats to democracy, because absent demands to uphold democratic norms and institutions from their citizenry, particularly in the face of authoritarian populist political movements, democracies may fail. Now, much of the existing work in American politics on democratic backsliding has focused on the ways in which political elites, elected officials, politicians, how have they undermined democratic norms? So many of you, for example, may have read Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's provocative book, How Democracies Die. This outlines ways in which elites can subvert democratic processes. But in this project, I'm aiming to uncover what motivates ordinary citizens, and in particular, ordinary white citizens, to endorse or oppose democratic principles. And in particular, I intend to illuminate the individual level psychological predispositions that are associated with a rejection of democratic principles and policies. So, in other words, I am considering who supports autocracy and why. Now, my argument is we can't understand the erosion of democracy in the US without viewing this phenomenon through the lens of race and white identity politics. And to help illuminate my argument, I want to turn briefly to the historical record to say that what we're observing today is part of a pattern across time and space in the US, a pattern in which the protections of democracy have often been limited to white people, and in which democratic backsliding has often happened during conflicts about whether to extend democratic rights and privileges to racial and ethnic minorities. So, in other words, we need to situate our understanding of democratic backsliding today in the racially authoritarian context of US history. So, if we go back to the country's founding, we know that slavery continued to exist and suffrage was largely limited to property owning white men. There was a push for a more inclusive democracy in the 19th century, and white men secured universal suffrage regardless of property status in new state constitutions, but they also disenfranchised free blacks in the North. And this promoted what many scholars have called a white man's republic. And then a few decades later, the Constitution failed to resolve the country's conflicts over slavery peacefully, produced succession and war, and then a first attempt at building multiracial democracy during Reconstruction failed. And by the late 1890s, Southern Democrats had built stable one party authoritarian regimes that disenfranchised and repressed all African Americans in the South and many poor whites. So it was 7 more decades before the civil rights movement forced the passage of civil and voting rights legislation that produced only by the early 1970s what we would consider today's, I think, tenuous multiracial democracy, which is only a half century old. And now there are plenty of additional examples over the course of American political development, but my point is that a common thread in the US anti democratic movements that we have observed over time has almost always been an effort to preserve white supremacy and white dominance. And when we take the historical record into account and we consider the events of our current era, the more precise question that political scientists and political observers need to ask is not merely whether white Americans support democracy, but instead whether they support multiracial democracy. So that brings us today to the MAGA movement and to Trump, a president who has appealed to many whites concerned about their group's status in a changing country, who has arguably undermined and promises to undermine democratic norms in the US. Trump, as we are all aware, has threatened the legitimacy of the United States electoral system. He's threatened to challenge constitutional rights with executive orders. He's undermined the role of legitimate news media. He's weakened important institutions of government. And part of his success in doing this is by way of connecting the interests of whites to anti democratic actions. And this is in keeping with other work on democratic backsliding outside the US, which argues that anti democratic elites can be electorally successful when they exploit a country's socio-political tensions and then present supporters with a leadership narrative that addresses their grievances. So in the US case, Trump has connected whites' sense of racial grievance in the face of demographic change with his authoritarian governance. And what that means today is that, as in the past, many white Americans have been reluctant to condone democracy when it means more than democracy for white people. So I suspect that many white Americans are fair weather Democratic supporters. They support this form of governance when it benefits their racial group, and then they support more authoritarian forms of governance when they believe it's more beneficial for their race. But of course, it's not the case that all white people are likely to feel this way. Instead, we got to find that in particular, it's whites who feel this sense of solidarity with their racial group and who have this kind of sense of grievance politics that's captured by a concept that I call racial group consciousness. So, to explain what this means, there are different ways that social psychologists and social scientists have conceptualized and measured the attachments that we have toward our various social groups. So, for example, we often measure partisan attachments by asking people how strongly they identify as a Democrat or a Republican. Now, consciousness is another way of understanding individuals' orientations toward a social group. This form of attachment is composed of identification with a group, and then it's coupled with the belief that the group's standing in some kind of social hierarchy is lower than the members think is fair, or that their status is somehow threatened and challenged. And then it also entails the belief that group members should work together to protect or enhance the status of their group. So, from my perspective, group consciousness is a particularly useful way of capturing white grievance politics. It entails an investment in the racial group and entails a sense of identification, as well as the belief that whites are threatened by other groups and that white people should engage in politics to protect their group. So, to give you a sense of how we assess whether people have a sense of consciousness, I asked this series of questions on national public opinion surveys. So, how important is being white to your identity? How likely is it that many whites are unable to find a job because employers are hiring minorities instead? How important is it that whites work together to change laws that are unfair to whites? And how much discrimination is there in the United States today against white people? And what I find generally across surveys is that over 30% of white Americans have moderate to high levels of racial group consciousness. So, the implication of my argument is that whites with higher levels of consciousness are less likely to support sentiments important to multiracial democracy, and they're more likely to support anti democratic norms and policies, especially those that are associated with Trump or that are framed as benefiting whites as a group. So, I'm going to test these hypotheses in a number of different domains. I'm going to look at attitudes broadly about multiracial democracy, opinions about the electoral process, and then attitudes toward authoritarian governance and beliefs about democratic norms more generally. So, I'm drawing on data from a number of national surveys, and I'm looking at the relationship between white racial consciousness and attitudes about multiracial democracy and support for autocratic behaviors, particularly with respect to Trump. So, what I'm going to show you next is the relationship between consciousness and support for a number of political attitudes. And all of these analyses are taking into account other factors that we think might be related to these preferences, like partisanship, authoritarian personality traits, demographic characteristics. So, what I'm showing you is that even after accounting for these other things, we're going to find some really powerful relationships between higher levels of racial consciousness and support for autocracy and opposition to multiracial democracy. So, I'm going to run you through here some of our findings. Let's first consider the relationship between consciousness and attitudes about growing racial and ethnic diversity in the US. So, here from a recent survey conducted in 2024, I find that whites with higher levels of consciousness are far more likely to agree that the growing racial and ethnic diversity in the US poses a threat to traditional American culture, and presumably a culture that reflects white Anglo Protestant images as the prototypical American. So, you can see as consciousness goes up, so does support for this sentiment that diversity poses a threat to culture. Let's look at the relationship between consciousness and great replacement theory. So, whites with higher levels of consciousness believe that it's likely that the Democratic Party is intentionally making it easier for immigrants to enter the country in order to replace white voters. And support here among those with the highest level of consciousness for the great replacement theory is extraordinarily high. I also find that whites with higher levels of racial consciousness were much more likely to condone the Capitol riot. And, not surprisingly, we expect that these whites condone the riot because they question the legitimacy of the 2020 election. And as expected, racially conscious whites were much more likely to view Trump as the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. Now let's turn to the erosion of norms associated with Trump. During his presidency, Trump tried to sidestep democratic norms, limiting the power of the presidency. We might therefore expect that racially conscious whites support more authoritarian behaviors on behalf of the president, and that's indeed what I find. So, higher levels of consciousness were strongly tied to endorsing the sentiment that having a strong leader is good for the US, even if the leader bends the rules. We might expect that these same whites condone the president ignoring the system of checks and balances that keep any one branch, including the executive branch, from becoming too powerful. And I find that these whites seem to be more supportive of autocracy. They believe it would be helpful rather than harmful if presidents could work without paying attention to Congress or the courts. Now, I want to point out this particular question on this survey was asked on the 2020 American National Election Study before the election. So Trump was still the president when this question was asked. Now, of course, given my argument, We expect that racially conscious whites would see Trump's abuse of democratic norms as in the interest of their racial group. But we would expect that these whites would support just Trump overstepping his power, not any president, so not Biden in particular. So to illustrate that this is the case, in a survey conducted in 2022, I included a question wording experiment where respondents were randomly assigned to either a version of the question that asked specifically about Trump or a version of the question that asked about Biden. So you can see the very left-hand panel, that's the original question, the original results from the 2020 American National Election Study when Trump was president. And you can see that if we asked about Biden in particular, that effect between consciousness and support for this sentiment basically disappears. There's no relationship. But if you look, if we're asking about Trump in particular, you can see a strong and positive effect. So whites with higher levels of consciousness are not supportive of Joe Biden ignoring checks and balances, but they're extremely supportive of Trump ignoring our system of checks and balances. And finally, an important norm within liberal democracies is that the civil rights and liberties of citizens are protected. Now, the 2020 American National Election Study asked an important and abstract question about a central democratic norm, whether or not the preferences of the majority should prevail, even if those preferences infringe on the rights of minorities. And interestingly, higher levels of white consciousness are linked to endorsing this belief. But this question raises an important thought experiment, which is how will these same whites feel when their group is no longer in the demographic majority of the US? So I tested this exact question with a survey experiment in a study. In the control condition, I simply asked the same question about the will of the majority prevailing. And in the treatment, I asked this question, but immediately before, I reminded respondents of the threat of their numerical decline, of whites' numerical decline, with a question about how they feel about projected demographic changes. And I wanted to know whether whites with higher levels of consciousness might respond differently to this idea of the majority prevailing when presented with information about their pending numerical decline. And it turns out they do indeed respond differently. So this plot provides us with the level of support for the majority prevailing over the rights of minorities in that control condition without the reminder of demographic change, and then in the treatment condition. And you can see that quite clearly. Whites low on consciousness don't move much, but those high in consciousness look quite different in the two conditions. So in the control, as expected, they're supportive of the majority prevailing. When reminded that whites may soon no longer be in the majority, their support declines pretty significantly. So these results suggest that it's not that these whites support democratic norms in principle. It's that they endorse beliefs that are associated with their group standing to gain, and they're far less likely to endorse democratic sentiments when they're reminded that their group may stand to lose. So, to conclude, what I want us to take away from this is that many white Americans support the shifts toward autocracy that happened during the first Trump administration and that we anticipate happening under the second. And their support is deeply tied up in opposition to multiracial democracy and in the preservation of white supremacy. So many whites see these shifts not as a threat, but instead as a promise to protect their racial group's power and status. And so I'll end there, and I look forward to having a conversation with all of you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Ashley. Appreciate it immensely. So we're kind of opening it up, folks, to get in the queue here. So please just either raise your hand or put something in the chat. Let me start off while we're waiting here, Ashley, with a question. Oh, we got Laura Horwitz. Laura, why don't you come on? Let's go on